Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, comment which story you thought was the scariest. Now lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. I was looking for a break from the monotony, a change of scenery. The idea of a remote cabin far away from the city noise sounded like exactly what I needed. The listing popped up during one of those late-night scrolling sessions, secluded, charming, and just isolated enough to feel like a proper retreat. The pictures showed a modest, single-story cabin surrounded by woods that stretched on forever. It wasn't glamorous, but it had everything I was after: solitude, peace, and a chance to recharge. The directions emailed to me were straightforward. I took a highway out of town, then a smaller road that wound through miles of farmland, and eventually turned onto a gravel track that disappeared into a forest. The drive took longer than I thought, and by the time I arrived, the light was fading. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof and a porch that sagged slightly at one end. It felt ordinary. The key was under the doormat, just as the host had promised. I let myself in and was met with the faint smell of wood smoke and something faintly herbal, like dried lavender. The inside was quaint, with mismatched furniture and knickknacks scattered about as though someone had been living there a lifetime and left everything behind in a hurry. The kitchen was small, but functional. There was a bookshelf in the living room crammed with paperbacks and old board games. In the bedroom, a patchwork quilt lay neatly folded at the foot of the bed. I made myself a cup of tea and settled in. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped away, leaving the cabin cocooned in darkness. The trees pressed close, and the wind played through their branches in soft, uneven gusts. I caught glimpses of stars whenever the clouds shifted, and the silence was deeper than anything I'd known in the city. And it was the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound. The creak of the floorboards underfoot, the click of the kettle cooling on the counter. I didn't mind, it felt still. Later, I was in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard the sound of a car engine. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the night it cut through everything else. I froze for a moment, listening as the sound came to a stop somewhere nearby. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for something. After a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing, probably someone taking a wrong turn down the gravel road. I was drifting off when I heard the creak of the porch steps. The door opened without hesitation. A man and a woman, both elderly, stood framed in the doorway. Their expressions were sharp, their features shadowed in the dim light. They stepped inside as though they belonged there, and for a moment I thought maybe they did. I scrambled out of bed, clutching my phone, my heart racing. The woman's eyes swept over the room, narrowing at the sight of my things: the duffel bag by the wall, the phone charger snaking across the nightstand. Her lips tightened into a thin line as she glanced back at the man. He looked confused but said nothing, his eyes flitting around the room like he was trying to make sense of something. I wanted to explain, to tell them I'd rented the place, but their presence felt certain, like I was the one intruding. I fumbled for my phone, pulling up the email with the rental listing, but when I scrolled to find it, there was nothing. No email, no listing, nothing. The woman looked at me like she was waiting for me to say something, her expression unreadable. The man shifted his feet, glancing towards the bedroom door, his gaze flickering over the room's corners. It was as though they were trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew. I backed out of the bedroom and into the living room, my pulse thundering in my ears. The elderly couple followed, their movements unhurried, their presence filling the cabin in a way I couldn't quite put into words. The woman picked up a ceramic vase from the mantel, turning it over in her hands like she was testing its weight, while the man ran a finger along the edge of the bookshelf. They moved through the space like people who'd lived there for decades, their touches faintly reverent, faintly accusing. I opened my phone again, trying to check the location. The map app refused to load, no service. The panic rising in my chest was sharp and sour, and I stumbled towards the door, desperate to get outside, to breathe air that wasn't suffused with their quiet insistence that this was their place, not mine. The porch felt unsteady beneath my feet, the chill of the night sinking into my skin. I stepped off and turned to look back at the cabin. It was dark now, except for the faint yellow glow spilling from the windows. The elderly couple was still inside, moving through the space like ghosts, revisiting the place where they died. I waited in the driveway, staring at the cabin as the minutes crawled past. My car was still parked where I'd left it, its cold metallic shell oddly out of place in the soft wilderness. The door to the cabin swung open again. The woman stepped out, pausing at the edge of the porch. Her eyes found me in the darkness, and I felt my throat tighten. She didn't speak, didn't move any closer. She just stood there. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. The night pressed in, the stillness broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the trees and the quiet creak of the cabin's timbers. The old couple didn't leave. They stayed there, moving through the cabin as though it was theirs. When dawn finally began to creep over the horizon, I got in my car and drove. The gravel track seemed longer this time, the woods stretching on for miles. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, the cabin shrinking into memory, its walls holding on to things I didn't want to think about. When I checked the rental site again later, there was no trace of the listing, no history, no host, nothing. It was as though it had never existed. I've been driving trucks for over 20 years. Long hauls, short hauls, doesn't matter. When you're on the road as much as I am, you see things, odd things sometimes, but most of it blurs into monotony. Miles of tarmac, the hum of the engine, and the white noise of your own thoughts. The occasional strange sight usually turns out to have a mundane explanation. Headlights that seem too far apart are just an oversized load. That figure on the roadside is a tree stump after all. You get the idea. I don't spook easy. I guess that's what I'm saying. I was driving through northern Montana that night, hauling a load of farming equipment out to Spokane. The stretch of road I was on was about as lonely as it gets. 2 lanes, no other cars, and not a single light except for the truck's beams cutting through the darkness. The kind of place where the air feels empty and time seems to stretch. You'd think after years of this, I'd be used to it, but some nights the emptiness of it all gets under your skin. I was passing through a particularly dark stretch of forest when I spotted her. She was walking along the shoulder, shoulders hunched, her hair hanging like a curtain over her face. At first I wasn't sure if she was real. She almost looked like a trick of the light. But as the truck approached, I saw her clearly. A young woman, mid-20s maybe, wearing jeans and a plain sweatshirt. And she had a small backpack slung over one shoulder, and she hugged it close like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Picking up hitchhikers isn't something I normally do. Too many risks. Too many stories about good intentions gone bad. But there was something about her. The road was endless in both directions, and she looked like she'd been out there for hours, maybe longer. My hand moved almost automatically, flipping on the turn signal and easing the truck to a stop a few feet ahead of her. She climbed into the cab without hesitation, shutting the door behind her and settling into the seat like she'd been waiting for a ride. She didn't say much. Barely anything, actually. Just gave me an address when I asked where she was headed. It was a diner, hours away, in a small town I'd heard of but never been to. That was it. For most of the drive, she was quiet. I tried asking a few polite questions, but she just shook her head or gave short, clipped answers. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she kept her gaze fixed on the dashboard. She clutched that backpack like it was something precious, something she didn't want me to see. I gave up trying to make conversation and focused on the road. She had this way about her that made the cab feel smaller than it was. It wasn't anything she did. She wasn't fidgeting or making noise. If anything, she barely moved. But there was something in her presence that felt out of place, like she didn't quite belong there, like she was misplaced somehow. The miles rolled by. The night stayed dark and quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. Eventually the trees thinned out and the road straightened, leading us towards the faint glow of civilization. The diner was exactly what you'd expect for a place like that. Neon sign flickering over a gravel parking lot, a handful of cars scattered around. She climbed out of the cab without a word, her backpack still clutched tightly against her chest. She paused for a moment, standing in the pool of light from the diner's sign before walking inside. I sat there for a minute, watching her disappear through the door, then leaned over to check the passenger seat. That's when I noticed the backpack. She'd left it behind. I don't know why, but the sight of it there made my stomach twist. It was small, plain, nondescript, just a black bag with a single zippered compartment. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, but not by much. Curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped it. Inside there was a stack of photographs. They were old. Some of them faded and curling at the edges, black and white mostly, though a few were in color. I flipped through them, my fingers trembling slightly. The people in the photos looked ordinary, families posing in front of houses, kids playing in backyards, teenagers leaning against cars. But there was something about their faces that made me pause. I recognized some of them, not personally, but from the news. These were the faces of people who'd gone missing, people who had vanished from towns along the routes I'd driven 100 times. The kind of stories that made the rounds for a while before fading into the background noise of the world. There were names written on the back of some of the photos, along with dates, dates that stretched back decades. The more I looked, the more I realized that every single one of them had been taken from somewhere along the highways that crisscrossed this part of the country. I put the photographs back in the bag and zipped it up, my hand shaking. My first instinct was to run inside and find her, demand an explanation. But when I looked towards the diner, she wasn't there. The door was open, swinging slightly in the wind, but she was gone. I drove for hours that night, unable to shake the image of those photographs from my mind. When I finally stopped to fuel up, I checked the bag again. It was empty. The photographs were gone. I don't know who she was or where she came from. I've replayed that night over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it, but I keep coming back to the same question. Why me? Why that stretch of road? That night, that girl. I still drive the same routes, I still pass through the same towns, but I haven't seen her again, and every time I pass a hitchhiker standing on the shoulder, I think about stopping, I think about rolling down the window and asking where they're headed, but I never do. I wasn't planning to be out so late that night, but time has a way of slipping by when you're with someone you click with. Her name was Rachel, and we'd met just a week earlier at an office event. She'd laughed at some joke I'd made, and from there it felt natural. She invited me over to her apartment to hang out, and when I arrived, I liked her place immediately. It was cozy, well decorated in that minimalist but warm style you only ever see in magazines or Pinterest. It didn't look like my usual life. Cluttered, practical, boring. Her apartment, 1408 on the 14th floor of the Dorset Heights building, was like stepping into a curated slice of someone else's world. We spent the evening chatting, drinking wine and listening to music. It felt easy, familiar, even though we didn't know each other that well. The view from her balcony was incredible too. The city sprawled out beneath us, alive with lights and movement, even so late at night. There was a faint chill in the air, though, just enough to make you want to stay indoors. By the time I checked my phone and realized how late it was, I felt almost guilty for overstaying my welcome. I said my goodbyes, grabbed my bag and headed out. I don't know why, but the ride home felt strange. Not eerie or sinister, just odd, like a faint itch in the back of your mind you can't quite pinpoint. It was probably the wine, or maybe I was just tired. Either way, I brushed it off and went to bed, thinking about how much fun I'd had. The next morning, I decided to stop by her place again. I wanted to drop off a book we'd talked about. It was one of my favorites, and I thought she'd like it. Plus, it was an excuse to see her again. The Dorset Heights building looked the same as it had the night before. A clean, modern high-rise with tinted glass and polished floors that gleamed under the lobby lights. The receptionist at the desk glanced up as I walked in, but I gave her a polite smile and headed straight for the lift. When I stepped out on the 14th floor, something immediately felt off. The corridor looked different, not dramatically so, just small things. The walls were painted a slightly different shade of beige, and the carpet seemed more worn than I remembered. I chalked it up to being in a rush the night before. I found the spot where her door had been, 1408, right at the end of the hall on the left-hand side, except there was no door. The space where it should have been was blank wall, unbroken by any sign of an entrance. I stood there for a long moment, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I must have counted wrong or mixed up the floors. It was the only explanation. I walked back down the hall, checking each door as I went. 1401, 1402, 1403. They were all in order, all exactly where they should be, but 1408 wasn't there. I headed back down to the lobby. The receptionist was watching me now, her expression somewhere between curiosity and concern. I hesitated, feeling a little ridiculous, but eventually asked about the flat. She told me there was no 1408. I must have looked confused because she went on to explain that the building didn't have a flat with that number. She said it wasn't uncommon in high-rises, something about superstition. I laughed awkwardly and told her that couldn't be right. I'd been there the night before. She gave me a tight smile like she didn't believe me and then went back to her computer. I left the building, my mind racing. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Rachel's name. Her number rang twice before a robotic voice informed me that the line was no longer in service. I stood there on the pavement, staring at my phone like it might give me an answer. Maybe she'd moved out overnight, I thought. Maybe I'd written down the number wrong. I scrolled through my texts, looking for the one she'd sent with her address. It wasn't there. Her name wasn't in my messages at all. I don't know how long I stood there, replaying the events of the night before in my mind. I remembered the wine, the music, the way her flat had smelled faintly of lavender. I remembered the way her laugh had echoed in the small space, how she'd leaned against the kitchen counter with a glass of red in her hand, but now it felt like trying to hold on to water. The more I thought about it, the less certain I was that any of it had happened at all. I walked home in a daze, clutching the book I'd planned to give her. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her following me, her face half lit by the streetlights, but the streets were empty and the city around me felt suddenly unfamiliar. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed, staring at my phone, scrolling through my contacts and texts, looking for any trace of her, but she wasn't there. It was like she'd been erased, not just from my phone, but from my life. I thought about going back to the Dorset Heights building, demanding answers, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Her flat wasn't there. The receptionist wouldn't have any explanation. And Rachel was gone. The book is still on my nightstand. I haven't been able to get rid of it. Sometimes, when I glance at it, I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the way her flat had looked, the way her voice had sounded, and I know it was real, or at least it had been. I took up jogging a few months ago, mostly to clear my head after work. It's been my way of shaking off the day, breathing in the quiet of the neighborhood after dark. The streets are usually empty by the time I'm out, the houses all dark, except for the faint blue glow of TVs behind drawn curtains. There's a certain peace in the stillness of it all. My usual route takes me through a small park about 10 minutes from my house. Nothing fancy, just a patch of grass with a few benches, some trees, and a playground tucked off to one side. During the day, it's usually full of kids running around, their parents chatting on the sidelines. At night, it's empty, the swings hanging motionless in the faint orange light of the street lamps. That night, the park looked the same as it always did, quiet, deserted, nothing out of place. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the frost-tipped grass. I ran along the path that cut through the center of the park, my breath puffing out in white clouds. I was halfway through the park when I heard it. A creak, faint but distinct, the sound of metal straining like an old hinge being pushed back and forth. I slowed to a jog, my eyes darting to the playground ahead. The swings were the only thing that could have made that sound. The metal frame stood out in the dim light, the chains glinting faintly. One of the swings was moving, the others hung still, but this one rocked back and forth. The creak of the chains came with each sway, steady and deliberate. My breath hitched, my feet faltering as I watched. The air was calm, not a breeze strong enough to stir even the leaves on the trees. I stopped completely, standing at the edge of the path. The swing kept moving as though someone was on it, pumping their legs to push it higher. I couldn't see anyone, but it moved with too much force to be accidental. The other swings remained still. It slowed, gradually, until it came to a stop. For a moment, everything was quiet again, the silence pressing in on my ears. I thought about turning back, but my house was closer if I kept going. I started forward again, my pace quicker this time. Before I'd gone more than a few steps, the sound came again, the creak of the chains. I froze, my gaze snapping back to the swing. It was moving again, harder now, like someone had just jumped onto it. The chains groaned under the strain, the seat jerking back and forth. My chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I turned and ran. The path stretched ahead of me, the trees on either side blurring into a dark mass. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached my street. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled up the steps to my house, fumbling with my keys before slipping inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around me, but it didn't ease the prickling at the back of my neck. I locked the door, sliding the bolt into place with shaking hands. I tried to shake it off, pacing around the living room to calm myself down. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe there had been a breeze, a trick of the light. My mind was playing it up, making it worse than it was. Eventually, I convinced myself enough to sit down and try to relax. I flipped on the TV, letting the noise fill the quiet. It wasn't until later that I went into the kitchen. I had left the light off, the faint glow of the TV spilling through the doorway. I grabbed a glass of water, turning to look out the window above the sink. That's when I saw it. A handprint, small, smudged, pressed into the glass from the outside. The streaks of dirt stood out stark against the faint condensation, the shape unmistakable. My stomach flipped and the glass slipped from my fingers, shattering in the sink. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the print. The window was closed. The lock was secure. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. When I finally forced myself to step closer, my breath fogged the glass, blurring the edges of the print. The dirt looked fresh, wet in places where it had streaked downward. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, the handprint was still there, dried and crusted against the glass. I wiped it away, but even now I catch myself glancing at the window. I haven't gone back to the park. I don't jog at night anymore. But sometimes when the house is quiet, I think I hear it. The faint creak of a swing somewhere just beyond the edges of the silence. The night shift in the hospital always carried a strange stillness. It wasn't the same as peace or quiet, not in a place like that. There was always noise, the distant beep of monitors, the murmur of voices at the nurse's station, the shuffle of someone pushing a trolley. But it was the kind of noise you got used to so much that it became part of the background, the sort of thing you'd only notice if it suddenly stopped. I was working on the medical ward that night. It wasn't particularly busy, which was both a blessing and a curse. Fewer patients meant less chaos, but the hours seemed to stretch out forever. You'd find yourself checking the clock far too often, willing time to move faster. I was doing my usual rounds, checking charts, making sure the patients were settled. Most of them were asleep, their faces slack with exhaustion or medication. The low hum of machinery and the faint whisper of breaths filled the air. One of the rooms belonged to Mr. Wilkes, an older man who'd been admitted earlier in the week. He was recovering from surgery and was generally quiet, the kind of patient who didn't demand much, but always thanked you with a smile. When I glanced into his room, I noticed someone standing by his bedside. It startled me, but only for a moment. He was an older man, his back slightly hunched and his hands clasped in front of him. He stood near the head of the bed, looking down at Mr. Wilkes with a stillness that seemed almost reverent. I assumed he was a relative, maybe a brother or an old friend. It wasn't unusual for family members to stay late, even past visiting hours, especially when the patients were older. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether to remind him about visiting hours, but something about the scene made me hold back. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just standing there quietly. So I left him to it and moved on to the next room. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I finished my rounds, filled out my notes, and grabbed a cup of lukewarm coffee to keep myself awake. By the time morning rolled around, I'd nearly forgotten about the man by Mr. Wilkes's bed. When the day shift started, I handed over the usual notes and updates, then went back to check on Mr. Wilkes one last time before leaving. He was awake, his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, looking more alert than he had all week. As I tidied up the room, he told me he'd had a strange dream during the night. He said it had felt so real, as if someone had been standing over him. There was something in his voice, a hesitance maybe, or a flicker of something else, that made me pause. He said the figure hadn't moved, just stood there watching him. I froze at that, my mind immediately going back to the man I'd seen. I asked Mr. Wilkes carefully if he recognized the person from his dream. He shook his head and said the figure hadn't felt familiar. After I left his room, I couldn't shake the uneasiness that settled over me. I decided to check the security footage from the ward, partly to reassure myself. The cameras weren't great, they didn't cover every inch of the ward, and the footage was grainy at best, but they usually gave a clear enough view of the entrances to each room. I fast-forwarded through the footage from the night, my eyes scanning the screen for any sign of the man I'd seen. I felt a faint knot in my stomach as the minutes ticked by. There was no one. The camera outside Mr. Wilkes's room showed nothing but an empty corridor. No one entered or left the room all night. The only movement was me, pausing briefly outside before continuing down the hall. I replayed the footage twice, then a third time, feeling my pulse pick up with each pass. There was no way I could have imagined him. I'd seen him clearly, the way his hands were clasped in front of him, the slight stoop in his shoulders. He'd been there. I sat back in my chair, staring at the monitor as the footage looped back to the start. My reflection stared back at me, pale and faintly distorted in the screen's glass. I logged off the computer and left the ward as quickly as I could, stepping out into the harsh glare of the morning sun. The usual noises of the hospital surrounded me, conversations, phones ringing, the distant rattle of a food trolley. But none of it felt normal anymore. I haven't told anyone about what I saw that night, or about what I didn't see on the footage. But every time I walk past Mr. Wilkes's room, I catch myself glancing in, half expecting to see that figure again, standing there silently by the bed. I'd worked late, later than usual, and the office was one of those buildings that always felt colder and emptier at night. The others had left hours ago, their cheery good nights still hanging faintly in my mind. By the time I packed up, the only sound was the hum of the vending machine near the lifts and the occasional creak of the old building settling. The parking garage was a short walk from the building, tucked just around the back. It was one of those multi-level ones, concrete and steel, with flickering fluorescent lights that hummed in a way that always grated on your nerves if you spent too long under them. The night had turned brisk, the sort that makes you tuck your hands deeper into your pockets. I kept my head down as I crossed the street, the sound of my shoes on the pavement echoing faintly. The garage looked as empty as I expected, save for a handful of cars parked here and there. Mine was on the second level, tucked into a spot near the far corner. It was a habit of mine, parking as far from others as I could, less chance of scratches or dings. At night, though, it made the whole place feel a bit too isolated. I took the stairs up, my footsteps steady on the concrete. The air inside was damp, the kind of damp that seeped into your nose and left a faint, metallic tang on your tongue. The fluorescents overhead buzzed faintly, casting their flat white light on the rows of cars and the grey expanse of concrete. I was halfway to my car when I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't far off, just close enough to register. Steady even, the sort of sound that immediately draws your attention because it doesn't belong. I stopped, letting my own steps fade, and listened. The silence of the garage closed in around me. My heart thumped harder in my chest, the only sound breaking the quiet. I glanced over my shoulder. The far end of the garage stretched into shadow, the light above flickering faintly as if it might go out altogether. No one was there, just rows of cars, silent and still, their surfaces dull under the dim light. I shook it off and kept walking, faster now. My keys were in my hand, the cold metal pressing into my palm. The footsteps came again. They matched my pace, growing sharper as they echoed off the walls. I turned again, quickly this time, my shoes skidding faintly on the smooth floor. Nothing. The emptiness seemed louder now, the sound of silence almost buzzing in my ears. My breath felt quicker, my chest tight. I glanced towards my car, just a few more steps, and then looked back the way I'd come. Far down the garage, at the edge of the light, where it bled into the darkness, something stood. It wasn't moving, just a silhouette against the faint glow of the flickering light. It looked too far away to make out details, but it was there, distinct and unmoving. I blinked, then looked again. The space was empty. My legs carried me the rest of the way to the car before my brain could catch up. I unlocked it and slid inside, slamming the door shut. The air inside felt thin, my breath misting faintly on the windshield. As I reached for the ignition, something caught my eye in the side mirror. The figure was back. It stood at the far end of the garage, closer than before. The outline was sharper now, enough to make out that it wasn't just some trick of the light. It was real, a person or something shaped like one. I snapped my head around, twisting in the seat to look. The space was empty again. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but it was different now, closer. The side mirror caught it in eerie clarity, the way the light picked out the faintest details. A shape that didn't move yet seemed to press in all the same. My hands shook as I fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, the sound breaking the stillness around me. I kept my eyes on the mirror, on the figure that didn't belong. As I backed out of the space, it moved again. Not in the mirror this time. This time it was just there, in front of the car, too close. I slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the concrete. My headlights flashed over the empty space. Nothing stood there. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced back at the mirror. The figure was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I threw the car into gear and drove out of that garage as fast as I dared, the tires squealing faintly as I took the ramps. Every turn felt too sharp, every corner too tight, but I didn't stop. When I finally emerged into the open air, the cool night pressed against the windows, clear and still. I drove straight home, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to, glancing at the mirrors far too often. I don't know what I saw that night, or how to explain it. The mirror showed me something that wasn't there, something that couldn't be, but even now, when I'm parked somewhere quiet, I catch myself looking back at the mirror, half expecting to see it again. Something standing just beyond the edges of the light. I'd been driving rideshare for about 6 months, ever since I got laid off from my office job. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me something to do. Most nights were uneventful. Airport runs, bar drop-offs, people making awkward small talk to fill the silence. It was a job, plain and simple. Nothing too exciting ever happened, which was fine by me. That night was no different, at least at first. It was late, around midnight, and I was cruising through a quiet stretch of the suburbs. The streets were mostly empty, a few houses lit up here and there, but it was the kind of night where everything felt a bit stiller than usual. I was about to call it quits when a ride request popped up on the app. The pickup spot wasn't far, maybe 5 minutes away, so I tapped to accept and turned the car around. The address took me to a small convenience store on the edge of town. The lights inside were dim, and there was no one around except for the man standing by the curb. He looked ordinary enough, dressed in dark clothes, his hands in his pockets. He didn't wave or acknowledge me as I pulled up, just opened the back door and slid into the seat behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I waited for him to settle. He looked down at his phone, tapped something, and then set it in his lap. A second later, the destination popped up on my app, a residential address about 20 minutes away. I said something polite just to break the silence, but he didn't respond. That wasn't unusual. Some passengers don't want to chat, and I wasn't in the mood to push it. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road, heading towards the destination. The drive was quiet, too quiet maybe. Usually there's some kind of noise, people fidgeting, coughing, typing on their phones, but the back seat was dead silent. I could hear the faint rumble of the engine, the tires humming against the asphalt, and little else. Every now and then I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man sat there motionless, staring straight ahead. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but something about the way he sat, so still, so rigid, made my fingers tighten on the wheel. I told myself he was probably just tired, maybe drunk. People act strange late at night. The route took us out of the suburbs and onto a long, empty stretch of road. No street lights, no other cars, just darkness pressing in on all sides. I focused on the GPS, counting down the minutes until we reached the destination. About 5 minutes from the address, something made me glance up at the rearview mirror again. The back seat was empty. I blinked, gripping the wheel tighter. My heart started hammering, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him crouched on the floor or leaning against the door, but there was no one there. The seatbelt he'd buckled when he got in was still fastened, the buckle lying flat against the seat. I pulled over, my hands trembling as I threw the car into park. The road was dark and empty, nothing but trees on either side. I turned in my seat, craning my neck to look at the back seat properly. It was empty. No sign of the man, no sign he'd ever been there apart from that fastened seatbelt. I grabbed my phone and opened the rideshare app, scrolling to check the trip details. But there was nothing. No record of the ride, no pickup, no destination. It was as if I'd never accepted the request at all. The address the man had entered was still up on my GPS, so I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of what had happened. Then, against every instinct screaming at me to turn the car around and drive straight home, I decided to keep going. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I thought I'd find him there, waiting for me, ready to explain. The address led to an old house at the end of a long dirt driveway. The house was dark, its windows empty and lifeless. There were no cars in the driveway, no lights on, no sign of anyone living there. I sat there for a long time staring at the house, my fingers tapping nervously against the steering wheel. Eventually, I reversed back down the driveway and headed towards the main road. When I got home, I checked the app again. The ride was still gone, like it had never existed. I couldn't shake the image of that empty back seat, the seatbelt fastened like a phantom had been riding with me. The next day I drove past the convenience store where I'd picked him up. The parking lot was empty, the store closed, a for lease sign taped to the front door. I haven't driven rideshare since.